Chapter 2, Empirical Psychology and the Deep Psychology of Eros. 1. The Empirical Psychology of Couliano and its Sources. The focal point in Couliano's astrology and psychology is spirit. It might even be said that Couliano redefines spirit in every treatise, avoiding exact repetition through the use of new, concise, and careful turns of phrase. He says in his Theologica Platonica, quote, "The soul, being completely pure, conjoins with the solid and terrestrial body so removed from it, by dint of its nature, through the intermediary of a very airy and luminous corpuscle called spirit, generated by heat of that part where the blood is thinnest, whence it penetrates the whole body. The soul, easily sliding into this kindred spirit, at first propagates everywhere within it, and then, through its intermediary, throughout the whole body, and confers life and movement, thus bringing it to life. And through spirit it rules the body and moves it, and everything transmitted by the body to the spirit is perceived by the soul, which inheres in it. This act we call perception. Afterward the soul observes and judges the perception, and such observation is called fantasy." End quote. More details are given in the treatise De Vita Sana. Spirit is, quote, "defined by physicians as a vapour, sanguineous, pure, subtle, hot and shiny. Produced from the thinnest blood by the heart's heat, it flies away to the brain and enables the soul to use actively both the internal and external senses." End quote. The most elaborate definition is in the treatise De Vita Colitis Comparinada. Spirit is, quote, "a very thin body, almost non-body, and already almost soul, or almost non-soul and almost body. In its composition there is a minimum of a terrestrial, a little more of an aquatic, and still more of an aerial nature. But most of it partakes of the nature of stellar fire. It is altogether shiny, hot, humid, and invigorating." End quote. Also, the theory of the impossibility of knowledge, sine conversione ad phantasmata, without reducing sensory language to phantasmic language, is proclaimed in this passage from Sopra lo Amore, or Commentary on Plato's Symposium. Quote, "Using the senses, spirit grasps the images of external bodies. Now, the soul itself cannot perceive those images directly, given that incorporeal substance, superior to that of the body, cannot be induced by the latter to receive images. Omnipresent in spirit, the soul can easily contemplate images of bodies, reflected in it as in a mirror. It is through those images it can appraise the bodies themselves." End quote. The metaphor of the mirror applied to the pneuma is to appear at greater length in the chapter devoted to theurgical purifications. In any case, it is useful to recall that, for a phantasm to form on the polished and reflective surface of spirit, it is first necessary that the object be seen, and its image carried to common sense through the pneumatic canals. It goes without saying that the phantasm is not only visual or audiovisual, it is, so to say, synesthetic, engendered by the collaboration of several or all senses simultaneously. Nevertheless, sight certainly plays the most important part in forming the phantasm. It is one of the reasons why it is believed to be, throughout the Platonic tradition, the noblest of the senses. We recall that, in Plato's theory of optics, the image was produced by a circuit bringing the visual ray from the eyes to its place of origin, and thence to the brain. Aristotle simplified that theory, denying that an igneous ray could emanate from the eyes. The Stoics and the pneumatic doctors chose one of those two positions. The Stoics and the Noetic doctors chose one of those two positions. For some, like Epictetus or Galen, but also for Epictetus's contemporary, the Platonist Plutarch of Chaeronea, the noema comes out of the sensory organ to enter into contact with the sensory object and carries its image to the hegemonikon. For the others, the image spreads through the surrounding air. Ficino remains of the same opinion as Plato and Galen. In the act of seeing, the internal fire is externalized through the eyes, mixed with the noematic vapour, and even with the thin blood that engendered spirit. That theory is confirmed by Aristotle himself, who relates that menstruating women who look at themselves in the mirror leave little drops of blood on its surface. This can only mean that it is the thin blood brought to the eyes along with the noema. This phenomenon is the origin of two related spiritual activities, the evil eye and love. The ungodly, regardless of whether he undergoes or causes the resulting infection, is unaware of what is going on. It is enough that someone looks at him. The noematic ray emitted by the other person will penetrate through his pupils into his spiritual organism, and on arrival at the heart, which is its centre, it will cause an agitating disturbance and even a lesion, which can degenerate into a bloody infection. In the opposite case, for instance, when the subject is fascinated by the beautiful eyes of a woman and cannot stop looking at them, he emits through his pupils so much spirit mixed with blood that his noematic organism is weakened and his blood thickens. The subject will waste away through lack of spirit and through ocular hemorrhage. Love's arrows, held in high esteem by the French poets of the Pléiade, were not for Ficino a mere metaphor. They were equipped with invisible noematic tips, able to inflict severe damage on the person shot. Had not Plato already said that love was a kind of ocular sickness, ophthalmia? And did not Plutarch ascribe to sight a miraculous force? Regarding the evil eye fascination, or jettatura, its etiology is the same. Quote, "Fascination is a force which, emanating from the spirit of the fascinator, enters the eyes of the fascinated person and penetrates his heart. Spirit is therefore the instrument of fascination. It emits from the eyes rays resembling itself, bearing with them spiritual quality. Hence, rays emanating from eyes that are bloodshot and bleary, on meeting the eyes of the beholder, carry with them the vapour of the spirit and of tainted blood, thus spreading the contagion to the beholder's eyes." End quote. So speaks Agrippa of Nettesheim after Ficino, but Girolamo Cardin, Della Porta and Johannes Via share the same opinion, as does Leonardo da Vinci, who informs us that there are some who declared such a phenomenon to be impossible because, they said, "No spiritual force can emanate from the eye, for it would use up the faculty of vision. Even if it were as big as the body of the earth, it would use itself up by looking at the stars." Among others, Leonardo compares the popular belief, also expressed by Ficino, that the eyes of virgins have the power to attract the love of men. The spreading infection of the blood and ocular hemorrhage are merely the least subtle of the pathological effects of Eros. It is at the level of phantasmic techniques that Ficino's empirical psychology presents us with the most interesting concepts. Circulating through the same noematic passage in which contagion of the blood is spread are images that, in the mirror of common sense, are changed into phantasms. When Eros is at work, the phantasm of the loved object leads its own existence, all the more disquieting because it exerts a kind of vampirism on the subject's other phantasms and thoughts. It is a morbid distension of its activity which, in its results, can be called both concentration and possession. Concentration, because the subject's entire inner life is reduced to contemplation of one phantasm only. Possession, because this phantasmic monopoly is involuntary, and its collateral influence over the subject's psychosomatic condition is highly deleterious. Interestingly, the love object plays a secondary role in the process of establishing the phantasm. It is only a pretext, not a real presence. The true object, omnipresent, of Eros is the phantasm, which has taken permanent possession of the spiritual mirror. Now this phantasm represents a perceived image that has gone beyond the threshold of consciousness, but the reason it has assumed such obsessional dimensions lies in the deepest part of the individual unconscious. We do not love another object, a stranger to ourselves, Ficino thinks. Thus, anticipating the analytic psychology of Carl Jung, we are enamored of the unconscious image. The lover carves into his soul the model of the beloved. In that way, the soul of the lover becomes the mirror in which the image of the loved one is reflected. Amans amati sua figuram sculpit in animo, fit itaque amanitus animus speculum in quo amati relucit imago. That entails rather a complicated dialectic of love in which the subject is changed into the subject, ousting the subject who, tormented by the anxiety of prospective annihilation due to being deprived of his state as subject, desperately claims the right to a form of existence. The phantasm that monopolizes the soul is the image of an object. Now, since man is soul, and since soul is totally occupied by a phantasm, the phantasm is, henceforth, the soul. It follows that the subject, bereft of his soul, is no longer a subject. The phantasmic vampire has devoured it internally. But it also follows that the subject has now grafted itself onto the phantasm, which is the image of the other, of the beloved. Metaphorically, therefore, it can be said that the subject has been changed into the object of his love. A strange situation without a conclusion if it continues thus. A person without a soul decays and dies. Ficino's subtlety does not go so far as to imagine what happens to that soul after death. He only avers that the beloved exists in duplicate, and the lover no longer in any form. A solution does exist, however, that the beloved accept, in his turn, the offer of love. In this case, he will also allow the phantasm of the lover to enter into his pneumatic mechanism, to establish itself there, and take the place of his soul. In other words, to grant the annihilated subject a place where his identity as subject can emerge from nothingness and gain existence. This is a good thing, since the soul as subject had already been substituted for the soul of the other. If he gives a soul back, he still keeps one. A has become B has become A, and everyone is satisfied. Quite elaborate dialectic, and when all is said and done, quite materialistic. But at the same time, very close to the dialectic animus anima in the analytic psychology of Carl Jung, in which the relationship between the sexes is envisaged in terms of the conscious domination of one of them, compensated by a subjection of the same at the level of the unconscious. The metaphors vary, but the general schema stays the same. Changed into B, A loves himself, and vice versa. Heterosexual relations are fundamentally a form of narcissism, Ficino believes. In the event that the object who has been substituted for the subject prevents the latter from loving himself, takes away from him the pneumatic mirror without which he is practically reduced to non-existence, the beloved can be called the murderer of the lover. After knocking hopelessly at the door of the other's eyes, this Narcissus will die through lack of access to the glossy surface of a spirit on which, or on whom, he can be reflected. A Narcissus without a mirror is a contradiction in terms. It follows that the meaning of the medieval expression dangerous mirror does not have reference to the pneumatic mechanism of another, but to that of the subject himself. Having too rashly welcomed the phantasm of the devourer, the imagination of the subject then chased the subject from its own dwelling place, turning it loose on the roads to nothingness where bodies have no shadow, and mirrors reflect nothing. 2. The art of memory. The art of memory, also a phantasmic process whose principles and history Paolo Rossi and Francis Yates have dealt with in their excellent books, form an intermediary link between Eros and magic. It concerns us here only to the extent that, without a general idea of it, we would be at a loss to understand the ideological scope of Ficino and other theoreticians of phantasmic love, such as Francesco Colonna and Giordano Bruno. The art of memory is a technique for the manipulation of phantasms, which rests on the Aristotelian principle of the absolute precedence of the phantasm over speech, and of the phantasmic essence of the intellect. The precise inference drawn from it, expounded by St. Thomas in his commentary on Aristotle's De Memoria et Reminiscentia, is that whatever is seen, thanks to its intrinsic quality of image, is easy to remember, whereas abstract concepts or linguistic sequences require some phantasmic support or other to charge the memory. This is why St. Thomas recommends recourse to the mnemotechnical rules contained in Ad Herennium, wrongfully attributed to Cicero, and also called Rhetorica Secunda. It is certain that the art of memory has been utilised in the Middle Ages in cloisters to foster teaching of abstract concepts, but also as a very important element of the monk's inner discipline. In the 14th century, 2 treatises in vulgar Italian deal with it, and even Petrarch was acquainted with its rules. But times change, and with the discovery in 1416 of Quintilian's Institutio Oratoria, which, by the way, does not endorse mnemotechnics, the humanists placed the arts and virtues of the ancients on a pedestal, whereas the Middle Ages utilised the pseudo-Ciceronian treatise Ad Maiorum Gloriam Dei, the better to bring to mind the majestic structure of theological concepts. Humanism sees in the Ars Memoriae an important weapon for social success to ensure, by means of an infallible memory, advantage over others. It is along these lines that the jurist Peter of Ravenna's treatise, Phoenix, Sive Artificiosa Memoria, was written. Venice, 1491. The reader of Rossi's or Yates' books doubtless recalls the function of art, which we shall try to reconstruct freely here without going into detail. Owing to the fact that perceptions have an intrinsically phantasmic character and are thus readily committed to memory, the task is to superimpose any contents, linguistic or conceptual, for instance a poem or classification of virtues, onto a succession of images. Now, those images can come from some place, but this does not prevent them from being, as well, phantasms produced for the circumstances by the imaginative faculty. In the first instance, the place must be chosen with care. Truly, this art demands a total concentration only possible in solitude. It follows that mnemonic activity can only be pursued in a church, a cemetery, a deserted place, or at home, avoiding all company and diversion. The parts of the place must be memorized in a certain order. On each part, the individual will superimpose a sequence to the message or the conceptual series which must be learned by heart. The indissoluble unity formed by the 2 discourses, phantasmic discourse and linguistic discourse, will be forever engraved in the memory due to the imaginary character of the first. There is no limit either to what can be memorized or in the choice of phantasms to be put to use. Finally, and here is the origin of the emblems, impressae, and emblematic legends of the Renaissance, phantasms can, as we have already said, stem directly from the imaginative faculty without an objective support. In this case, they will be constructed in such a way as to cover, through their parts, the segments of the message to be memorized. The principle of the priority of phantasm to speech has, in some cases, led to results of doubtful usefulness and applicability, such as the alphabets propounded in 1520 by Johann Romberg in his Congestorium Artificiosa Memoriae. In one of these, each letter of the alphabet is replaced by a bird whose name starts with the appropriate letter. A equals Answer, B equals Bubo, etc. The Florentine Dominican Cosimo Rosselli replaces birds with animals. In that way, the word aer, air, is memorized by means of the donkey, an elephant, and a rhinoceros. Here we are dealing with extreme examples of degeneracy of mnemotechnics, not to be confused with the real processes or with the amazing achievements of that art. Humanism highlighted the utilitarian rather than the speculative and intellective side, which, however, Marsilio Ficino seems to understand and appreciate. That said, we cannot discard the hypothesis that in the Western Middle Ages, or at least in the early Middle Ages, the art of memory was analogous to the preliminary stages of yoga in India, a perfected technique of meditation, with or without objective support, which, in creating a phantasmic world according to traditional rules, claimed nevertheless in its approximation this world was an imperfect equivalent of realities existing on an ontological level inaccessible to direct experience. The Renaissance knew two arts of memory. One, strictly utilitarian, was soon to degenerate into the alphabets of Romberg and Rosselli, and even into some impressae and emblems of a playful sort. The other was a continuation of medieval mnemotechnics and the universal art of Ramon Lull, who, by various methods, intended to construct a world of phantasms supposed to express approximately the realities of intelligible order, of which our world is but a distant and imperfect copy. Quid recipitur, ad modum recipientis recipitur. Everything that is accepted according to the object or person accepting it. Now, the method characteristic of human beings is the phantasm reflected in the mirror of the Pneuma. That is the only means at humanity's disposal for understanding reality clearly. It is fundamentally a question of performing a symmetrical maneuver in relation to the process of sensory knowing. This is the translation of the surrounding world into make-believe language so that the soul may learn about it. On the contrary, clear knowledge represents the translation into phantasmic language of real truths, which are engraved in the soul in order that discursive reasoning, an objective though impotent process, may have the means to grasp and monopolize them. Ficino's hieroglyphics, which we shall take up later, are symbols of intelligential awareness. But Ficino's successors go much further. They even assert that the rules of the phantasmic language that translates intelligential relationships can be represented in the form of theatre, to be meditated upon and learned by anyone who so wishes. The idea of theatre came from the Friulan Giulio Camillo del Minio, born around 1480, who spared no pains to see it realized. A professor at Bologna, Giulio Camillo was not a charlatan. He managed to interest Francis I in his theatre and, subsidized by the king, settled in Paris in 1530. In 1532 he was in Venice, where Viglius Zoochimus, who corresponded with Erasmus, came to see him. His letter to Erasmus mockingly describes the theatre of our artist with the heavenly memory, which the humanist of Rotterdam could neither appreciate nor understand. The year 1534 found Giulio Camillo again in Paris, but never able to perfect his construction. A wooden structure which, according to a letter of Gilbert Cousin, Erasmus's secretary, was still at the French court in 1558. Meanwhile, he was invited in 1543 to the court of Alfonso de Valas, Marquis of Vastos, the Spanish governor of Milan. Giulio Camillo lived just long enough to arrive there, for he died in 1544. Giulio Camillo, a modest and unassuming man whose Latin made him the butt of Zoochimus's jokes, left us few writings. He worked on rhetoric and translated L'Ide of Overo Form della Orazione, attributed to Hermogenes of Tarsus. But it seems he also studied the work of Pico della Mirandola, and perhaps also that of the Venetian brother Francesco Giorgi, which is based on Ficino. His main preoccupation was adequately to depict a cosmic model. This cosmic model certainly stems from Florentine Platonism. Camillo set forth in his schema in an obscure little treatise published in Florence in 1550, L'Idea del Teatro. His construction, which had the form of an amphitheatre of 7 sections, inspired to be an imago mundi, in which all ideas and objects might find their appropriate place by virtue of their planetary classification. Like any artificial system, this was doomed to be no longer understood as soon as the sets linking terrestrial phenomena to corresponding planets fell into disuse. We shall see later that they were constructed according to correlations between a planet and certain animals, plants and stones, and were transmitted by tradition with inevitable changes from the very beginnings of Hellenistic astrology. For the Renaissance mind, there existed still a kind of internal evidence inherent in the fact that the lion, gold, and the heliotrope belonged to the solar set. But this was only evidence of a cultural kind, becoming invalid as soon as astrology began to lose credibility. Giulio Camillo's schema, as Francis Yates discerned, was magical. He was inspired less by Pico della Mirandola's speculations than by Ficino's treatise De Vita Coelitus Comparanda. The subject matter symbolized by the dramatic features also came from Florentine Platonism. For example, the idea of the incorporation of the soul was represented by the image of Pasiphae and the bull on the door of the 5th level. Pasiphae symboled the soul attracted by the body, the bull, a theme associated with black magic, Goetia, by Plotinus and also by the Church Fathers. In its descent among the planetary spheres, the soul was supposed to invest itself with an aerial quality, the pneuma, enabling it to become incarnated in the material body. We can readily understand that working out all the details of that plan, including not only images but also cryptic formulas, was too much for one man. Once he vanished, no one else could take his place to continue his work. At bottom, Giulio Camillo's ambition amounted to no less than to forge a figura universi, a cosmic form, ex qua tamen beneficium ab universo sperare videntur, through which it was hoped some profit might be obtained from the universe. Ficino himself, who describes in detail the realization of an universi figura, was not one of those who, like Giulio Camillo, cultivated the art of oratory. This is probably why it never occurred to him that the imago mundi could have the aspect of a theatre. For him, the phantasmic expression of the intelligential world did not assume forms as concrete as Camillo's dolls. On the contrary, it ought to be something mysterious, unreachable by the profane. Egyptian hieroglyphics fulfilled those requirements wonderfully. In the first place, they had the prestige of tradition. Plato himself had spoken of them, Phaedo, 274c to 75b, and Plotinus too in his Aeneads. Quote, the Egyptian priests, in symbolizing divine mysteries, did not use small characters, but whole forms of plants, trees, and animals, for it is clear that God's system of knowledge of things does not take the form of multiple fancies. ex cogitatio nem multipliciem, about the thing, but sees the thing itself as a simple, stable essence. End quote. Ficino does not end his commentary on Plotinus with this. He continues with a reference, arbitrary moreover, to one of the hieroglyphics of Ho'apollon. The treatise, Hieroglyphica, attributed to Ho'apollon and translated into Greek by an unknown writer called Philip, was an attraction in Florence of rather recent appearance. The codex had been discovered by Cristoforo Buondelmonte in the island of Andros and taken to Florence. The Greek text was only published in 1505, followed in 1515 by a Latin translation, but Ficino's contemporaries were well acquainted with it, since Leon Battista Alberti had extracted it from it some whimsical explanations of hieroglyphics in his De Architectura, 1452. The fashion of pseudo-Egyptology made a big hit, especially in the art of emblems that Giovanni Andrea Alciato, 1492 to 1550, in his Emblematum Pater et Princeps, was to develop in the 16th century, not without debt to his precursor Piero Valeriano, Giovan Pietro della Fossa, 1477 to 1558, author of Hieroglyphica sive sacris Egyptiorum aliarumque gentium litteris commentarii. Hieroglyphics, symbols endowed with the dual preferential claim of having aroused the interest of Platonic diviners and also of being fashionable with Ficino's contemporaries, assumed particular importance in his concepts, as pointed out by André Chastel in his fine book Mazil Ficin et Lat. Ficino, as Eugenio Garin tells us, conceived of philosophy as an initiation into mysteries, consisting of a gradual rise in intellectual loftiness, receiving in response from the intelligential world a phantasmic revelation in the form of figurae. These figurae, characters of an inner phantasmagoria staged by the soul itself, represent the modality by means of which the vision of the soul opens before the oculus spiritualis. The organ has taught the inner consciousness about existence through diligent meditation. This experience, so well described by P.O. Christler, has to do with the formation of an inner awareness, interpretable as a phantasmic process, a visio spiritualis in the Augustinian sense. It is, in fact, a need to discover a means of communication between reason and intellect, the soul, and this means is provided by the spiritual eye, the mysterious organ that permits us to look upward toward the higher ontological levels. André Chastel believes the term hieroglypha, as used by Ficino, does not refer to a form communicated by the soul to the faculty of reason through the intermediary of the pneuma. Rather, it is a symbol of meditation, keeping the spirit in a state of tension propitious to a kind of meditation close to ecstasy, the talisman of the oculus mentis. Pseudo-Egyptian hieroglyphics, emblems, and impressae were wonderfully suited to the playful spirit of Florentine Platonism, to the mysterious and mystifying quality Ficino believed it had. Pythagoras, Socrates, and Plato had the habit of hiding all divine mysteries behind the veil of figurative language, to protect their wisdom modestly from the sophist's boastfulness of joking seriously and playing assiduously, io cari serio et studiosissimi ludere. That famous turn of phrase of Ficino's, translation of a remark by Xenophon concerning the Socratic method, depicts, at bottom, the quintessence of every phantasmic process, whether it be Eros, the art of memory, magic, or alchemy, the ludus puerorum, preeminently a game for children. What indeed are we doing in any of the above, if not playing with phantasms, trying to keep up with their game, which the benevolent unconscious sets up for us? Now, it is not easy to play a game whose rules are not known ahead of time. We must apply ourselves seriously, assiduously, to try to understand and learn them so that disclosures made to us may not remain unanswered by us. In the Ball Game, De Ludo Globi, 1463, by Nicholas of Cusa, these verses have been inserted, although they do not belong to the author. Ludatur hec ludus, sed non puerilita et sic. Lucet et orbe novo sancta Sophia Deo. Sic omnes lucida pii, Dionysus et qui. Increpuit magno mystica verba sono. The Ludus Globi is the supreme mystical game, the game the Titans made Dionysus play in order to seize him and put him to death. From the ashes of the Titans struck down by the lightning of Zeus arose mankind, a race guilty without having sinned because of the deicide of its ancestors. But since the Titans had incorporated part of the god, men also inherited a spark from the murdered child, the divine child whose game is a metaphor of the ages. Ioan is a child who plays checkers, the sovereignty of a child. 3. The phantasmic Eros and the appeasement of desire. Wherever Eros is at issue, so is desire. Where desire is at issue, so is its appeasement. That applied to Dr. Freud as much as to the theoreticians of love in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, with one exception, the latter sometimes revealing amazing knowledge through their freedom and candour with regards to human sexuality, nevertheless grant the existence of other forms of satisfaction of desire. Indeed, Eros, being by nature spiritual, hence located at an intermediate level between the soul and the body, the intelligential world and the sensory world, and can lean toward one or the other of those cosmic regions. But given that desire is the pursuit of a phantasm, and that the phantasm itself belongs to a world, the imaginary world, the mundus imaginalis, whose loftiness Henry Corbin has so well described without dealing with its penumbra, there is also a third possibility, namely that Eros burns away altogether in a phantasmic sphere. The spiritual Eros functioning anagogically, that is what Dante propounds, as R. Klein has so well demonstrated. The natural love that descends to the body. That is the experience of many writers of the school of Boccaccio, rediscovered in Freudian psychoanalysis with the stubborn intent of reducing to a single factor the multitudinous manifestations of Eros. It goes without saying that those two traditions have one point in common, the recognition, if not of the nature of Eros, at least of its phantasmic techniques. For all parties, the preliminaries of desire consist in setting up a phantasm within the subject. For some, this phantasm will have the capacity to awaken their allayed desire, to propel and accompany them on their trip through the intelligential cosmos. This will become a heroic passion, ending in an ecstatic fusion of the hunter and the object of his hunt, according to an image employed by Ficino and later revived by Giordano Bruno. For others, the phantasm will only point to a painful and urgent need for a physical release, which increases in proportion as its fulfillment is postponed. In this case, there will be a fundamental contradiction between the medical concept of a phantasmic Eros that disturbs the equilibrium of the organism and demands prompt assuagement to restore this equilibrium, and the concept of the faithful, a complete denial of the former, finding expression through a semantic inversion valorizing the disequilibrium in terms of a plenary spiritual experience. This will to distort, first brought to bear on medical matters of this period, subsequently provoked much ribaldry directed against believers in mystical love whose ideas, bereft of sense, are to become synonymous with an erotic strategy in which the purely verbal idealization of woman is merely an expedient to silence her resistance as quickly as possible. The conflict between these two important traditions also signifies the relative dependence of the one on the other. Erotic mysticism becomes distinct by contrast to the naturalistic trend, whereas the latter defines its positions in controversy, explicit or implicit, with the idealism and the intellectualism of the faithful. A third trend, as meek and obscure as the others were famous and persistent, almost passed unobserved or was close to being assimilated by the two others. Indeed, there can exist phantasms unrelated to a real object, but thanks to the quality of their images, there can be no phantasms without physical support of one kind or another. That is why a story about phantasms is always interpretable. We can see it either as the symbol of adventures in the intelligential cosmos or as the allegory of actual events. Unfortunately, although there are many theoreticians of phantasmic Eros, the number of writers who have tried to describe phantasms at work is very limited. One of them surely is the respectable monk from Treviso, Francesco Couliano, who, having become sacristan of the monastery of St. John and St. Paul in Padua, died in 1527 at the age of 94. He is the author of a work almost unique of its kind, the Hypnerotomachia Polyphili, which, as the author points out in the book's explicit, had been finished May 1st, 1467, but was not published until 1499 by Aldo Manuzio. It was paid for by a magistrate of Verona called Leonardo Crasso. The contents of the Hypnerotomachia tally with the date 1467. Indeed, the work is external to the current of ideas circulated by Marsilio Ficino, beginning more or less in 1463. From our point of view, the fact that it escapes Ficino's influence is invaluable. Even when expressing a personal point of view on love, which rarely happens, Pico della Mirandola, Pietro Bembo, Baldassare Castiglione, Leo the Hebrew, and Melanchthon bear the indelible mark of Ficino's thought. On the contrary, Colonna, though he too treats of the phantasmic Eros, is original and inimitable, less in his ideas, a common heritage of the period, of which Ficino is to become the systematic organizer, than in the literary and didactic qualities of his work. 4. Phantasms at work. Let us make the acquaintance of phantasms. Taken literally, the title Hypnerotomachia means a love fight during sleep. This leads us to expect that a person dreams of phantasms involved in an erotic fight, perhaps his own erotic phantasm. That is precisely what happens. Two phantasms, that of the dreamer, Polyphilus, and of the girl he loves, Polia, are at the centre of the scenario. The tale is not constructed so as to be easily understood. It is an enigma whose solution is given only at the end. The reader is informed that Polyphilus seeks Polia, but does not know why or how. Of the 311 pages of the Guagan Curva edition, the first part takes up 250, whereas the second, which provides indispensable explanations, takes up only 60. The first part tells of the endless roaming of Polyphilus amid the ruins of antiquity, of triumphs, emblems and impresae, each of its own secret meaning. As Yeats observed, it could be a matter of mnemotechnics, escaped from control and degenerated into wild imaginings. In any case, such onirico-archaeologico-mnemotechnics, however fascinating, will not preoccupy us here. In the end, Polyphilus finds Polia, and the lovers plead their case before the heavenly tribunal of Venus. The second part, which contains two monologues, is therefore a tale within a tale, and the end is destined to complicate the enigma still more. We learn that everything that happened was only Polyphilus's dream, so that the search for Polia and the appeasement of desire were but adventures in fantasy. Neither mystical love nor vulgar love, Polyphilus's dream represents the trite story of phantasmic desire that finds fulfillment. The tale is saved from platitude and indecency by its phantasmic quality. Desire, provoked by a phantasm, is appeased by a phantasm after a period of erotico-mnemotechnic tribulations. 5. The depth psychology of Ficino, descent of the soul. Quote, "Souls descend into the bodies of the Milky Way through the constellation of Cancer, enveloping themselves in a celestial and luminous veil which they put on to enter terrestrial bodies. For nature demands that the very pure soul be united with the very impure body only through the intermediary of a pure veil, which, being less pure than the soul and purer than the body, is considered by the Platonists to be a very convenient means of uniting the soul with the terrestrial body. It is due to that descent that the souls and bodies of the planets confirm and reinforce in our souls and our bodies respectively the 7 original gifts bestowed upon us by God. The same function is performed by the 7 categories of demons, intermediaries between the celestial gods and men. The gift of contemplations is strengthened by Saturn by means of the Saturnian demons. The power of the government and empire is strengthened by Jupiter through the ministry of the Jovian demons. Similarly, Mars, through the Martians, fosters the soul's courage. The Sun, with the help of the solar demons, fosters the clarity of the senses and opinions that makes divination possible. Venus, through the Venerians, incites love. Mercury, through the Mercurials, awakens the capacity for interpretation and expression. Finally, the Moon, through the lunar demons, increases procreation." End quote. Amore 4:4. Except for the idea that the planets exert their respective influences on the soul and the human body through the intermediacy of demons, this passage from Ficino is inspired by the Commentary on the Dream of Scipio by the late Neoplatonist Macrobius, who must have had as his source a treatise by Porphyry. Macrobius's work had been circulated in the Middle Ages, and it is possible that Ficino was acquainted with its commentary attributed to William of Conches, one of whose 14th century manuscripts is in the National Library in Florence. The author of Philosophia Mundi, in dealing with procreation, divided the womb into 7 compartments, retaining a sperm in which the human form is imprinted like a coin. It is very likely that the 7 divisions correspond to the planets, whose influence on the development of the embryo would thus have been prepared in advance through divine wisdom permeating nature. Those seals that mould the human form, the cellulae impressioni humanae formae signatae, recur in Ficino at the level not of the maternal womb but of the heavenly one. Indeed, the process of cosmization of the soul, of its entry into the physical universe, can be compared with the gestation and growth of the embryo. On the one hand, there is the soul child, which inclines downwards and descends into the cosmic womb formed by the 7 planets. On the other, there is the child's body, preparing to receive the soul. In William of Conches, the parallelism is total, for the human womb is in the image of the cosmos. That parallelism also exists in Ficino in the framework of a depth psychology that the author does not try to make too complicated. Its basis is the concept of a stamped impression or planetary form, combined with a rather peculiar theory, unconfirmed by an astrological treatise, concerning the influence of the stars on various erotic groupings. Ficino states that certain planetary types, Jovian, solar, Martian and Venerian, are more apt than others to receive the arrows of love, and that they give preference to a person belonging to their type, the Jovian to a Jovian, etc. To explain the profound and unconscious attraction between persons, he gives an example that serves as model for the entire foregoing series. Let us suppose that a soul descends into the body at the time Jupiter reigns in the zodiac. It will bring into itself a Jovian image that will also be imprinted on its pneumatic medium. Another form of the same kind is impressed on the sperm, which, to receive it, must have certain qualities at its disposal. If it does not, Jupiter's traits can only be transmitted more weakly, resulting in a certain disharmony of the body. The moment this uncouth Jovian meets a Jovian who has had the good luck to receive proper sperm, he will be captivated by the other's beauty, unaware that the deep cause of his affection resides in the attraction to the same planetary prototype, especially when it has been better incarnated in a terrestrial body. Quote, "Those born under the same star are so disposed that the image of the most beautiful among them, entering through the eyes into the soul of the other, conforms absolutely to a certain pre-existent image, impressed at the beginning of procreation onto the celestial veil of the soul, as well as on the soul itself." End quote. Amore 6:6. The two original images are copies of the same planetary prototype, even though one is less perfect than the other. A profound recognition will take place, and a wish to emulate will seize the form of the weaker Jovian, who will tend to perfect himself according to the model furnished by the other. Ficino emphatically states that this unconscious impression stamped on the soul is not a phantasm. On the contrary, it is a matrix conditioning the phantasmic processes, to the extent it imperiously commands the phantasms received to conform to a prenatal prototype. This theory of the facies, or pre-existential image of the individual, stems from a stratum of very archaic beliefs, also found among so-called primitive peoples. The later Neoplatonists gave it a philosophical foundation. Later, the Kabbalistic Zohar by Moses of Leon again took up the idea of an internal impression stamped on the soul. Quote, "During the nuptial mating on earth, the saint, etc., sends a human form which bears the imprint of the divine seal. This form is present at the mating, and if we were allowed to see it, we would observe above our heads an image that resembles a human face. It is in this image that we are formed." End quote. Zohar 3:104a-b. Through Neoplatonist doctrine, Ficino means to provide a transcendental basis for the empirical psychology of Eros. This field is bounded by the completely unconscious choice made by the soul from among the phantasms capable of becoming the object of love. Melancholy and Saturn. Of all the planetary types, the Saturnian has special importance in Ficino's thought. This is probably a plea pro domo sua, for Ficino called himself a Saturnian because on the day of his birth, October 19th, 1433, Saturn entered the sign of Aquarius. The aesthetic recluse, prey to periodic attacks of elation and depression, catatonic and pessime complexionatus, but also gifted for contemplation of the highest aspects of the human being, is only the description of the result of introspection directed by Ficino upon himself. It goes without saying that Ficino's explanation of the syndrome of melancholy comes from the mould of a culture that is no longer ours. But insofar as the semiology of that morbid affliction is still under consideration in our treatises of psychiatry or psychoanalysis, there are also perceptible connections between Ficino's observations and those of our modern observers, such as Freud or Binswanger. The question of Saturnian melancholy has been dealt with in detail by E. Panofsky and F. Saxel in their famous analysis on the Melancholia I by Dürer. We refer to it here only to add some particulars. The psychology of antiquity was founded on a very interesting quaternary classification, which deduced the principal temperaments from the predominance in the organism of one of the four humours: yellow bile, phlegm, blood, and black bile. atrabilis, in Greek melania kolos, hence the word melancholy. The four elements, the cardinal points, the divisions of the day and of human life correspond to those four liquids of the organism. The series of yellow bile comprises fire, the wind, Eros, summer, high noon and maturity. That of phlegm, water, the ulster, winter, night, old age. That of blood, air, the zephyr, spring, morning, youth. That of black bile, the earth, the wind, boreas, autumn, evening, and the age of 60. The predominance of one of the humours determines the four temperaments, choleric or bilious, sanguine, phlegmatic, and melancholic. Somatic traits, or complexion, in Latin, mixture of humans, bear a close relationship to character. Melancholics are, in general, pessime complexionati. Thin and gloomy they are, into the bargain, clumsy, sordid, drab, apathetic, cowardly, irreverent, drowsy, lazy. In short, people without religion or self-control who lack respect for human relations. The symbol of the atrabilious temperament is an old miser lying on the bare ground. This unflattering description of the most unfortunate of the four fundamental psychosomatic types corresponded, in astrology, to the traditional description of the pet aversion among the planets, Saturn, the lord of Capricorn and of Aquarius. A systematic description of the characteristics of the planets and of the signs of the zodiac has been given us by the iatromathematician Johannes of Hassfurt, admirer of Ficino, in his De cognoscendis et medendis morbis ex corporum coelestium positione. Quote, Saturn is cold and dry. The Saturnian individual has a broad and ugly face, small eyes downcast, one larger than the other and having a spot or a deformity, thin nostrils and lips, connecting eyebrows, bristly black hair, shaggy and slightly wavy, uneven teeth. His beard, if he has one, is sparse, but his body, especially his chest, is hairy. He is nervous, his skin is fine-grained and dry, his legs are long, his hands and feet deformed with a cleft heel. The body is not too big, honey-coloured, smelling like a goat. In his complexion, coldness and dampness prevail. End quote. The psychic qualities granted by Saturn are hardly more attractive. The Saturnian man is apt to ponder advice given him by well-disposed people, but, being misanthropic, does not take it. It rarely happens, but if he takes a fancy to someone, he is passionate, just as he is passionate in his hatred. He is prone to anger, but he can control himself for a long time. A glutton, he is usually fat and slow-moving. Miser, impostor, crook, thief, sorcerer or magician, you have no doubt met in your life this silent type of the profession of usurer, farmer, revolutionary, perpetrator of treason. In conclusion, the Saturnian is sad and solitary, without faith in God or his fellow men. The sign of Capricorn, dominated by Saturn, is inordinately cold and dry, destructive of plants, trees, and seeds. It is a feminine sign, nocturnal, heart of the south, solstitial, hibernal, changeable, underhand, grubby, and melancholic. The two most unfortunate psychosomatic types, whose natures are so similar they end by intermingling, nevertheless each have an extraordinary compensation. Theophrastus early differentiates between two kinds of melancholy. This was later reiterated by Aristotle. One kind, produced by cold black bile, answers to the above-mentioned characteristics, whereas the other, caused by the predominance of the hot humour, confers upon the subject a psychic lability and instability that goes with genius. The following symptoms are apparent in hot melancholy, according to Aristotle. Fits of gaiety, ecstasy, lability, inspiration. The eccentricities disappear from the behaviour of the melancholic of genius without disturbing his extraordinary faculties if the temperature of the bile is modified. What are these exceptional tendencies of the melancholic? According to Albert the Great, hot melancholy, or melancholia fumosa, has two extremely important effects on the phantasmic activity of the subject. The first consists in the mobility of the phantasms within the subtle organism. The second in the great capacity of phantasms to stay impressed upon the pneuma. This brings with it, besides a prodigious memory, an extraordinary capacity for analysis. That is why, Ficino tells us, all the great men who have ever excelled in art have been melancholic, either because they were born so, or became so through assiduous meditation. However, Henry of Ghent, who recognised in melancholics a special aptitude for the arts due to their highly developed phantasmagoric faculty, denied them any leanings toward abstract thought. Ficino corrected that injustice by identifying the melancholic with the Saturnian. If the former had been traditionally regarded as a labile genius, the latter also revealed a fundamental ambiguity, having been forced by his ruling planet into a solitude characterized either by perversity or by the highest contemplative attitude. Aptitude. Saturn does not lay down a law concerning the quality and destiny of mortals, but makes a man distinct from others, divine or bestial, happy or oppressed by extreme misery. That Saturn should, in addition to the aforementioned disagreeable characteristics, endow its subjects with an exceptional propensity toward metaphysical contemplation and abstract reasoning, without objective support, albeit with a minimum of phantasmic activity, is an idea as old as Hellenistic astrology. Being the furthest planet from Earth, Saturn occupies in the Aristotelian Ptolemaic Thomistic system the nearest position to the sphere of fixed planets and hence to the Empyrean, a privileged position inconsonant with the exclusively negative qualities attributed to it by Babylonian astrology. This ambiguity holds regarding the doctrine of the descent of the soul on Earth. Macrobius and Proclus attributed to Saturn the contemplative faculty, theoreticon, and the faculty of reason, logisticon, whereas Servius attributes to it torpor and moodiness, the Hermetic poimandres, the lie, and the commentary on Macrobius in the Florentine Codex, nothing less than tristitia, synonymous in the Middle Ages with accidia or melancholy. Ficino himself, as we have already said, endorses Macrobius and Proclus. Klebanski, Panofsky, Saxel, and Vind have demonstrated that the fusion of the syndrome of melancholy and Saturnism was achieved by Ficino. More recently, Giorgio Agamben, having misunderstood that Ficino's originality consisted not in expressing new concepts but in combining existing ones in a new way, has countered these scholars with the idea that the ambiguity of melancholy was already well known in the Christian Middle Ages. Indeed, the ambiguity of Saturn was no more foreign to the Middle Ages than to antiquity, but Ficino should probably be credited with having superimposed the two faces of Saturnism upon the two faces, the bestial one and the face of the genius, belonging to melancholy. Through this identification, the melancholic obtained from Saturn that which in principle he had always been denied, the aptitude for metaphysics. The Saturnian, too, could pride himself on having the faculty of imagination and of prophecy bestowed on him by melancholy. The star of misfortune is also the star of the genius. Imperiously he detaches the soul from appearances. He opens to it the secrets of the universe. Through the trials of melancholy he brings to bear a more penetrating sensitivity. Ad secretiora et altiora contemplanda conducit. Agrippa of Nettesheim, who inspired Albrecht Dürer's Melancholia I, reiterated Ficino's ideas without taking account of the traditional divisions. In his classification, the number 1, recapitulated in the title of Dürer's famous engraving, referred to the Saturnians whose imagination predominates over reason, the great artists and artisans, which formerly would have been a contradiction in terms, since Saturn's strong point was precisely the faculty of reason and not of fantasy. Solely Ficino's identification of melancholy with the Saturnian enabled Agrippa to mix the characteristics of those two types, otherwise distinct from one another. Neither Ficino nor Agrippa laid claim to anything new when they asserted that melancholy, being a kind of vacatio, separation of soul from body, bestowed the gift of clairvoyance and premonition. In the classifications of the Middle Ages, melancholy was included among the 7 forms of vacatio, along with sleep, fainting, and solitude. The state of vacatio is characterized by a labile link between soul and body, which makes the soul more independent with regard to the sensible world and allows it to neglect its physical matrix in order in some way better to attend to its own business. When it gains awareness of its freedom, the soul devotes itself to contemplation of the intelligential world. But when it is merely roaming about between worlds, it has nevertheless the faculty of noting events occurring far away, in space as well as in time. For we can say, in simplifying a question that is neither easy nor univocally soluble, that time in the intelligential world is not deployed. Past, present, and future are not separate and distinct. Everything is there sub specie eternitatis. That is why the soul that casts a glance into the eternal archetype of time can obtain, about past and future, knowledge that does not come from sensory experience. Obviously, these things occur only if the pneumatic casing protecting the soul is sufficiently transparent to permit it to see, and this can be either a natural gift or an acquired or accidental quality. The pneumatic sagacity of melancholics has been well expressed by a Calabrian monk of the Reformation period, Tommaso Campanella, author of the treatise De Sensu Rerum ac Magia, in the chapter entitled Of the Sagacity of Melancholics, Pure and Impure, and of Demonoplasty and Consent of the Air. In the Aristotelian tradition, Campanella differentiates between hot melancholy, pure, and cold melancholy, impure. The second quote: according to the learned Origen, it is the seat of elfish spirits and of the devil. The latter sees that the corporeal spirit is infected by melancholic vapours, whose oppressiveness forces the reasoning faculty to be inactive, and then, being impure and heavy, delights in that sort which befogs the spirit, and enters and uses the spirit to horrify and restrain reasoning, and enjoys the strange place it has entered. End quote. Pure melancholy, on the other hand, quote, is hot and a sign of sagacious spirits, but not their cause. The cause is the subtlety and facility of spirits. That is why melancholics are determinedly solitary, for all movement troubles them. They withdraw and think a lot because their discernment is very sharpened. More than other men, the melancholic has aptitude for premonition through dreams, because his spirit is more subtle and more gifted than the spirit that is too thick to receive the almost imperceptible movements of the air. Unquote. Now, we already know that pneumatic waves causing pressure on the surrounding air are apt to be picked up by another spirit. If the latter is adequately trained, it will succeed in noting not only the waves whose length coincides with the capacities of his sensory organs, sight and sound, but also the imperceptible pneumatic movements, such as those of thought, for example. It is simply a matter of having a phantasmic apparatus sufficiently pure, that is, clean, to be able to vibrate to the wavelengths below the threshold of perception. Thus, Campanella tells us, when they see a person, they quickly guess his thoughts by picking up the imperceptible movement his spirit imparts to the air in the act of thinking, and they are also capable of learning everything quickly. We have to pay for everything in this world, and those with supernormal faculties must pay most dearly. Capable of extrasensory perception, Ficino's melancholic is an abulic, a borderline case, often tempted by suicide, when he is dissuaded from carrying it out, as in the famous instance of Porphyry lectured by Plotinus. The cause of his difficulty in adapting to his mortal condition is an intense nostalgia for his celestial country, for the intelligential world. Nostalgia for a lost object that is later manifested in Freud's description of the syndrome of melancholy. In this interpretation, Ficino's Neoplatonist and Christian heritages commingle. Indeed, the contrast between cold or impure melancholy and hot or pure melancholy was transformed in the Middle Ages into an antithesis between a tristitia mortifera, or diabolica, or yet again tristitia seculi, which induces the religious person to seek secular distractions, instead of the profound boredom which, according to William of Averna, all theological questions instill in him, and the tristitia salutifera, or utilis, or yet again tristitia secundum deum, which stems from the feelings of being deprived of God. This is why William of Averna goes on to say, many passimi ac religiosimi men of his time burned with desire to be seized by the melancholic sickness, that they might increase their nostalgia for God. When the idea of the lost country atrophies, only the baneful symptoms of melancholy remain. Kierkegaard, that intimate confidant of melancholy, has given us a masterly description in his De Psalmata. Quote, I wish for nothing. I do not wish to ride horseback, it is too strenuous. I do not wish to walk, it is too tiring. I do not wish to lie down, because then either I should have to lie down constantly, and I do not wish to do so, or I should have to get up, and I do not wish to do that either. Summa summarum, I do not wish for anything. End quote. According to André Chastel, the concept of the romantic genius who is variable, catatonic, prey to sudden fits of enthusiasm that disturb his abulia, is disclosed to the modern world through Ficino. The genius who is familiar with the alternations of inspiration and of distress, afflicted by furor and then bereft of his inner force, belongs to no conventional type. He is of interest because of the dramatic intensity of his experience. Whether or not it bestows genius, melancholy is primarily a pathological syndrome that became known through the Corpus Hippocraticus and Aristotle, as well as through Sigmund Freud. This evil, like the plague, has struck our continent repeatedly. Aristotle mentioned some melancholics: Hercules, Bellerophon, Heraclitus, Democritus, the poet Maricos, and Ficino adds others: Sappho, Socrates, and Lucretius. The medieval cloisters were decimated by Acadia, and the castles of the 11th to the 13th centuries resounded with the chants and atrabilious verses of the troubadours and love's faithful, men suffering from the lethal syndrome of amor Eros, itself a kind of heady melancholy. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the fashion of black bile reaped a rich harvest of victims, including Ficino, Michelangelo, Dürer, and Pontormo. England had its share, such as the poets John Donne and Richard Crashaw. In the 19th century, dandyism was an infantile camouflage for the wounds of melancholy, a sickness that attacked Baudelaire as well as Kierkegaard, De Quincey, Coleridge, Nerval, Huysmans, and Strindberg. It is very likely that this melancholic epidemic can be explained also by a secret solidarity between the patient and the sickness, since the yearning for useful suffering is not limited to contemporaries of William of Averna, but affects all those who, for one reason or another, were not satisfied with what earthly existence can offer. They had bumped against its confines. Everything is thus, and cannot be otherwise. Ontologically justifiable, this state of unemployed boredom or lethargy is a consequence for Ficino of a phenomenology of daily life that anticipates Pascal and Heidegger. Man exiled, exul, in the world lives in a permanent state of torpor or sadness, maior, whose origin remains mysterious. Unable to live alone, he always seeks the company of others, trying through diversions, oblictamenta, to forget his anxiety. He plunges into a kind of delirium that imparts to his life the unreal quality of the dream. This analysis, to be sure, lacks the emotional quality of Pascal's work, but Pascal's concept closely resembles that of Ficino. Quote, "Men have a hidden instinct that prompts them to seek diversion and occupation from without, stemming from resentment at their unceasing misery, and they have another secret instinct remaining from the grandeur of their primary nature, which makes them aware that happiness resides only in tranquillity. And from those two contrary instincts is formed a confused plan, hidden from sight at the bottom of their soul, that leads them to reach for tranquillity through agitation, and always to imagine that the satisfaction they lack will come to them if, by surmounting certain obstacles they face, they can thus open the doors to peace and tranquillity. So that in considering themselves seriously, man is more to be pitied for being able to amuse himself with such low and frivolous things than for being afflicted by real misery. And his diversions make much less sense than boredom." End quote.